First of all, to me, it's just incredibly striking because the same thing happened during the Korean War. Then the Soviet Union and China made similar accusations against the United States of engaging in bacteriological warfare. So to repeat this so clearly so many years later, 70 years later, is very interesting. But it definitely takes this negative form that you're talking about in the Russian case. It's not about promoting Russian or Chinese soft power. It's about, in a way, destroying American soft power among any audiences who will buy into it. And that's something I hadn't really thought about before. Is there much in the literature, and do you think it makes sense to talk about some of this contest over soft power, or as the Chinese put it, the contest over this kind of yanyu, this discourse power? Is there more than just getting one's own voice, but also about suppressing the other voice? Or maybe the Russian attitude is, we're not going to successfully tell a story about Russia, so the better bet is just to tear down American efforts to try to sell soft power?
Yeah, I think we should be thinking about this as having this maybe a alternative or at least additional component of destruction, right? It's not all about competing for stories or visions. That's a very soft kind of, soft power, soft sort of way of looking at it. And I think it's Western centric as well. It's like, who has the best culture, who has the best, most appealing values. But part of it is also, how do you discredit, your opponent as competition for these visions? And I think, I think Monroe Price, one of the scholars used to be at Annenberg, he came up with the term soft war. So instead of calling it soft power, it's soft war, which is, he hasn't developed the concept, I think, as much, but he has a book looking at this in the context of Iran. So it's interesting. I haven't seen this concept come up in other places. So maybe there's a need to come back to some of these terms. And of course, information war is a term that's used by the Russian government regularly, maybe not as much by Chinese government. So I think the destruction element is almost like accompanying the storytelling for China, because on the one hand, you have this attempt to still tell a China story. On the other hand, you have wolf warrior style diplomacy emerging, or it has already emerged, with officials seemingly being promoted for this kind of rhetoric, where they do, deliberately poke at and sometimes attempt to destruct, I think, the morality, right, of the U.S. It's not even just about values. Does the U.S. have any moral agency? Can it serve as a moral actor? And I think that's what a lot of their comments are pointing at, is that it cannot. So in the context of Ukraine, we've seen the biolabs theory being promoted. We've also seen the double standards logic being promoted a lot. For example, the US has participated in its own wars, it has committed war crimes, and therefore it has no moral legitimacy when it comes to critiquing Russia, China, or being part of this conflict as a mediator. It just doesn't have any moral legitimacy. So I think there is this kind of interesting, really stress of morality here by the Chinese communicators, some of these communicators. In the Russian case, though, I think we don't see as much of a multidimensional view. I think a lot of it really is focusing on the West in a very skillful way sometimes. Up until recently, of course, RT was widely available, and they really emphasize appealing to segments of the population that are on extremes, of society, the extreme left, extreme right, inviting them to participate in various talk shows. I've even encountered quite a few faculty at top universities here in the US who participate in RT debates and shows without very much self-awareness that this is actually a propaganda arm of Russian government, because they're invited to, to share their voices and views that are often not heard of or not invited to be channeled by CNN or by other major mainstream news outlets. So they've really taken advantage of that and localized significantly. A lot of the correspondents are American or European, and you don't really sense what's really Russian about it until you get deeper into the thematic content of their reporting. So I think that in the Russian case, maybe there's a bit more synergy around this notion of negative soft power and destructive soft power. And there's also a lot of emphasis on how dangerous soft power is. Putin himself has made that statement multiple times, that soft power is a dangerous idea because it tends to be, for him, correlating with regime change. So he thinks that soft power was part of the reason Ukraine had a Maidan revolution. It's part of the reason why we've seen various social movements around post-Soviet space. So he blames soft power for revolution, for social change. And as a result, one has to mitigate that and, push back aggressively with multitudes of tools.
Do you think that the equivalent in China might be reflected in the current trend under the Xi Jinping administration to, I think it's fair to say, tighten ideological controls? All these various technologies of control that used to be reserved criminals or for the ethnic minority regions. Increasingly, we're seeing those technologies of control imposed on, Shanghai, Beijing, ordinary Chinese. Do you think it's also basically part of it, perhaps a defensive concern or anxiety about the infiltration of Western? It used to be called in the 80s, 精神污染, spiritual pollution, but maybe Xi is now talking about or thinking about it as, Western soft power, could be corrupting Chinese hearts and minds, which could make the CCP regime less stable.
Yeah, I think that part of the concept of soft power, which linked to cultural confidence that we discussed very early on in our conversation, is also linked to defending Chinese culture. It's not only about promoting cohesiveness just through various activities and respect and recognition. It's also about defending against Western cultural flows. And even in this book, I note several scholars, Chinese scholars, who describe Western culture as a virus. So they kind of use this medical kind of terminology that we have to immunize ourselves against the virus of the Western culture, Western thought. And of course, under Xi, there've been more restrictions against teachings of Western materials at universities, and lots of ideological work that's using his own writings or other writings that are not coming from the West. So kind of really trying to homogenize and narrow down what's possible in the public discourse within China. And of course, the field of critical journalism, investigative reporting, any alternative voices, that space has significantly narrowed.